Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Clean Libertarian Podcast, and you guys are in for a treat. Today I had on Brian Saady. Brian is the author of a few books, and this man really has a solid understanding of geopolitics and exactly how these drug policy interventionist kind of tactics have hurt other countries, exactly what that looks like, and the blowback of that. And so this was a conversation that about 2 hours long, and I'm telling you, there is so much information in here. This was a pleasure to sit down and talk to Brian, and I hope that you guys get a lot out of it, if nothing else than to pique your curiosity. So because it's a longer episode, I'm not going to sit here and waste too much of your time. I'm just going to go right into it. So here is Brian Saady. I'm glad that you like it, and I know that you came highly recommended from a mutual friend of ours, Patrick McFarland, who I admire and respect completely. And I started looking into you, and you are extremely well versed in some areas of interest. But for the sake of the audience, and so I don't butcher your intro, would you mind kind of telling us who you are a little bit?
Sure thing. Yeah, it's kind of tough. I have a lot of areas of interest. So I wrote a book series called Rackets. That's kind of what I kind of try to focus upon. Is I focus on rackets, and there's many different forms of rackets, right? But probably the most area of my interest is the drug war. The topic that I'm probably most passionate about, most focused, where I put the most research is the war on drugs, and just. On so many levels, it's a failed policy, but it's also just a really disingenuous policy there's just so many tentacles, and there's just so much to unravel to it. And that's probably my main focus, is probably the drug war.
I mean, there's a lot of ground to cover there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've been going 50 years in, 60 now, right? It's been 60.
Really 100 years or so. I mean, you look at some of the earliest drug laws. It's people like to say 1973. Nixon when he launches it, but I mean, drug laws have been around before that. It really started to. It was really more at the state level. In the early 1900s. A lot of it was just kind of really racially based. There's a lot of the motivation behind that stuff. A lot of just kind of sort of sensational stories. There's some kind of conspiracy theorish stuff around that as well. I've kind of dove into it and say that there's some level to it. But really for the most part, a lot of that stuff, these early, opioid laws, a lot of that was kind of a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. Some of the early marijuana laws, cocaine laws, just a lot of, anti-Black and Hispanic sentiment behind those laws as well as some different interests as well. But those laws, like I said, we're looking at over 100 years. When we were talking beforehand, you were asking about the book. I wrote this book called $1 Trillion Con Game. The title behind that is because the U.S. government has spent over $1 trillion over all these decades trying to implement this failed policy that, again, costs the taxpayers over $1 trillion, and it's just been a total catastrophe as far as the effectiveness of those laws.
Yeah, the carnage, the finances, the destruction, just the entire thing has just been an absolute kneecap. To not only our civil liberties, in the process. I mean, we've seen nonstop lockstep, stepping towards more enhanced police state, and almost always up until certainly 9/11 and even afterwards, all in the name of ending the war on drugs. I mean, you saw the Department of Homeland Security take on pretty much a glorified extension of the DEA, claiming that, all of these opioid drug dealers, the heroin market is attached to the terrorists and, this and that. And, I don't know about the validity of that, but I know that I saw firsthand raids being done here in Oklahoma, what the Homeland Security was doing, and they weren't knocking up big time terrorist kingpins. They were knocking over guys who the DEA either couldn't or wouldn't touch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they're kind of, they go hand in hand. It's really messed up. So a lot of times, how should I phrase this? The drug laws allow the overbearing policies, right? And then those overbearing policies are then used a lot of times just to prosecute drugs. So let me give an example of what I'm trying to say. I didn't really word it that well because you mentioned 9/11, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a libertarian audience. I'm definitely a part of that crowd there as well. So 9/11, we had the Patriot Act, right? So before 9/11, those laws could not get passed, right? These just really, really intrusive. Almost everybody would say there's several parts of there that are unconstitutional as far as like search and seizure laws, right? So 9/11 happens. Okay, well, because we got to go get the terrorists, right? Because this is a terrorism law that's supposed to stop terrorism. I'm being a little obnoxious about the way I'm phrasing it for a reason. For a reason. So we passed this anti-terrorism law, right? And one of the things that I looked into, there were just several different provisions within the Patriot Act. One of which was this thing called sneak and peek searches. You ever heard that term before?
No, that's a first for me.
Right. So basically what it meant was like the police could just break into your home, sneak and peek without the actual evidence necessary, right? But they got to go and there have to be, if they then find the evidence, right, then they can get the search warrant. So they can skip the process. So, but again, this is supposed to be, you're only supposed to be targeting actual threats to national security. And a lot of times a lot of people are willing to sacrifice that. Well, if it's the next bin Laden, we got to break the rules, to stop a real terrorist threat, right? But then when we looked at like I think it was like the DOJ inspector general. They did a report like the first couple of years after this policy had been implemented, and they looked at, there was like a breakdown. I think there had been something like 2,000 searches or so conducted in that manner by federal authorities, right? And there was a breakdown in the report as to what types of cases that they were following. And terrorism was like, stop me if I'm, but it was something like less than 5%, like were actually used to really try to go after terrorism cases.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of those cases were just ordinary drug searches. But they use this twisted logic, and exactly like you're saying, there is some truth that yes, the term narco-terrorism is a real thing in some senses. In many ways, it's sort of a propaganda line. But yeah, there are legitimate terrorist organizations who do fund their organization through drug trafficking. But it's just there's some real mental jujitsu going on there to try to justify that stuff when it's really, so a lot of this stuff goes back and forth. And my long-winded point was also that, so we use the terrorism laws to go after the drugs, and then the drugs these laws to kind of then intrude on our civil liberties. So one example, and there's just so many, like early days of like the DEA, there's just been so many of these cases where they're able to infringe upon our civil liberties. And again, the same thing just goes by, well, we gotta fight this war on drugs, and we're just willing to sacrifice these constitutional principles because we gotta fight this war on drugs. I mean, there's just so many examples like that. I'm kind of drawing some blanks there, but well.
No. I mean, like the case that I was referring to, there was a local guy. He was my old dealer. But what he did was he would he would go out and counterfeit prescriptions, and so he was buying all the narcotics that he was had available was purchased at a CVS or Walgreens. DHS raided his home. There was no connection to any kind of like internet. The dude was whiter than I am. I mean, there was no foreign whatsoever. It's just wild to me how that happened. And it kind of goes in line with, you tell the general public this, it does not raise any kind of red flag or alarm. They're like, well, I mean, we got to get the drugs off the streets. I mean, what do you expect us to do? It's just insane how quickly, these liberties can be eroded in the name of ending a war on drugs that was never meant to be ended to begin with.
Right.
Because you and I were talking beforehand about money laundering.
Right.
What's your take on that?
Well, if you don't mind, and I'll kind of comment on the Department of Homeland Security. And my takeaway a lot of times is it's, again, I hate to use that word racket over and over again, but it really is sort of a racket, because what happens is Department of Homeland Security, they've got a budget, just like anybody who works in a job, you've got quotas, you got to meet, you've got benchmarks. And if you're not hitting certain goals, et cetera, then you don't, if it's government, you don't get the funding. If you're in the private sector, then you get fired. Right.
Right.
So the government, Department of Homeland Security, listen, there are real terrorism threats in this country. I'm never denying that, but I don't think that the level of threat justifies the budget and just the government state that we have to try to defend this stuff. So what happens? They get in these cushy jobs, and again, you got to justify your job. So you go out there and you do busts like that, and you do the mental jujitsu. You say, hey, well, this guy was a drug dealer. And you're saying that, again, these weren't even the powder. This was the prescription drugs, again, coming from supposedly a lot of these companies that are regulated by the U.S. government there as well. So the Department of Homeland Security's got to come in there and just they think it's splashy bus. There is a certain segment of America that cheers it on, like, yeah, we got the drugs off the street. And they really do believe that. And they think that those tax dollars were well spent. I think that segment of America is becoming smaller and smaller. I think a lot more people are just kind of catching on and saying that this doesn't seem to make sense. If it's Department of Homeland Security, they probably should just be focusing on actual national security threats.
Yeah.
It's just and again, it justifies the budget increases there. But yeah, you asked about money laundering. So that's kind of one of the things I was hinting at there too. So, we're talking about somebody who's taken legal prescription opioids and then selling them on the black market, right? So there's just a lot of corporate influence within this war on drugs. And like you said, money laundering. I also, in my opinion, a lot of the demand that we're seeing in this opioid crisis was in part, not entirely, created by those opioid companies. The Purdue Pharmas and stuff who, just completely manipulated the public, claimed that they had removed the addictive nature of their drug. We can go into that kind of stuff a little later. They can then go and hire people like a Rudy Giuliani, Eric Holder. I'm not saying that as a hypothetical example. Both of them did work as not under the Purdue Pharma payroll, but as independent contractors that go in there to help clean up their image, get their fines reduced, et cetera, and several other, sort of revolving door politicians. But sorry, I'm a little bit of a rambler, a ranter.
Hey man, I do it too. I do it too, bro. You're good.
But to get back to your question, sorry, about money laundering, like it's again, it just all kind of ties to that hypocrisy, right? So there's really just two sets of justice in this country. So when I think so that was one of the things we were talking about, right? So yeah, in my opinion, again, I'm for ending the drug war, but if we're in this state and you really are trying to crack down and really trying to remove as much of the supply of drugs as possible, in my opinion, the most effective path would be really aggressive money laundering laws. In my opinion, that rather than trying to do this approach where we go and they go after the low hanging fruit, i.e. going into like inner city neighborhoods, trying to get kids on the corner selling little nickel and dime bags, get them to snitch and keep working up and up the chain. To me, that's just a god-awful approach that really is just doomed to try to actually stop the supply. But if you actually look at the money and follow the money and put all of our technology and all of our infrastructure towards it, I think you would actually make a dent. I'm not saying that we'd actually, end this war on drugs, but that would be the more efficient way of going about it, right? But the problem with that is there's just a tremendous hypocrisy when it does come to money laundering laws. Like you can look at time and time again, these major financial institutions, they get busted for just, and I'm talking flagrant criminal behavior as far as the money laundering laws. HSBC, you can just rattle off the list of these. We're talking trillions of DOJ. They strut out there, yes, and we're cracking down on this company. In the case of HSBC, it was like over $1 trillion. And it wasn't just drug money; it was like corrupt foreign officials that they're helping them to park their money, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the crime and the criminal gain that they made versus what the fine that they paid to the DOJ, the fine is a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, the message is keep going for it. Keep doing what you got to do. And again, in my cynical view, most of that is because they have the money. They put those politicians in office. Those politicians then institute those, put those people into those high level positions. And I think some of them really, I'm not saying that, and I don't want to sound too cynical for everybody, but I think some of those people, they do want to fight the good fight. And it's just, there's just so much structural stuff that just block you from really doing an effective job. Because, and again, I'm not a big person on criminalization, but again, if we were going to go down this road and we were really going to try to fight the war on drugs really aggressively, if you started putting the CEO of HSBC in prison, if there was enough evidence to tie them to part of that criminal conspiracy, if we took that same level of aggressiveness that we do on drug conspiracy cases for like young African American men in these poor communities, like they're very aggressive as far as those cases. If there's even, the girlfriend of a drug dealer who just happens to be in the home, she'll get tied to a case, and then she's part of a conspiracy case, and she's looking at serious hard time if she doesn't
decades.
Right. But there's nowhere near that same level of aggression where we're talking about the highest levels, billions of dollars of drug money. At the end of the day, they go, oh, man, just a little slap on the wrist. And a lot of these companies repeatedly abuse these laws. So it's just never, you're never really going to make a dent in this war on drugs if that part doesn't change. And again, right. I'm not saying that I'm like, let's lock everybody up. I want to end the war on drugs. I think the whole thing is ridiculous to begin with. But again, that's really a lot of what I try to point out is just the absolute hypocrisy of what's going on. Because with that said, guess what? We do put people away for a long time. I read these cases all the time for money laundering, but it's always the small fish. It's the people who don't have political connections. It's usually somebody who's just very low in the chain. And I see it all the time, 10, 20 years for somebody who owns like a storefront that was, again, just fronting or doing something for some sort of a criminal organization. And they're just the tiniest of a fraction within that pool of the dirty money. And it's just, like I said, it's an absolute shame. And again, it's just part of the whole mess there, man.
Well, you bring up a good point, because that money laundering isn't something I've really ever equated into my arguments. It's just not something I've considered, but you make a valid point that, and surely somewhere along the line, somebody has noticed this and said, hey, man, if we really wanted to stop this is what we do, but they don't do it. Which is, it is what it is. Right. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is so when it comes to, money laundering and whatnot, a lot of the crypto people, anti-crypto people, that's what they're like, oh, well, that's why crypto needs to get stopped. Do you think that might be some of the reason why, some people in, big government, establishment government circles are so against cryptocurrency, is because of that? Or
well, a lot there. So one of the things you said, it's like, again, I'm such a rambler. Like you're like,
good man,
you've been out there. So anybody who's looked at my stuff, I'm a big George Carlin fan. He really influenced a lot of my worldview. And it was like, I'm 42 years old, about to turn 43. And I was a pretty young guy, and I remember watching one of his shows, and that would have been like the early 90s. And he basically made essential point, but he obviously did a lot funnier than I can. But just the point of like, you know what, if some of these bankers started going to prison, we'd end this war on drugs real quick, and the crowd laughs and all that stuff. Again, we're talking early 90s. So yeah, this stuff's been out there for quite a long time. And you see like pop culture shows like Breaking Bad and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of becoming a little more popularized, the understanding of that issue. But yeah, this stuff's been out there, but just really the hypocrisy of it all. So, but let's delve a tail into, I'm sorry, what you asked about with the crypto. So my opinion, as far as crypto is, guess what? It is an effective means. If you are trying to hide money and you are trying to launder money, it's an effective tool. But again, it kind of gets back to this hypocrisy. At the end of the day, in my opinion, I do think you're going to start to see, more regulation, more government, diving into crypto. You can already, like, as far as I think with your taxes, like you're asked to, there's a question about like Bitcoin or any kind of cryptocurrency. There's already stuff like that in the works. I'm assuming that at some point government is going to come in there and regulate more of it. And again, I'll kind of separate what I really want versus like what the status quo is. But again, it gets back to that really disingenuous nature, because I just think that there are probably politicians on Capitol Hill, and the lobbyists come in there and they show them, this cryptocurrency can be used as a money laundering method. And I think there's a pretty decent amount of that stuff out there already, right? So, they have a basic good nature thing of that we've got to stop this. It's, again, with money laundering, it's not just drug money. It's, like I said, corrupt foreign officials. You live in some other country, you want to park your money elsewhere in case the insurrection ever comes and then takes you out. You want to park your money elsewhere, so you got to launder the money. But my long-winded point of what I was really trying to say is that at the end of the day, yes, I do think it's a money laundering vehicle as well. But if the government, again, really cared about money laundering, these big banks, these too big to fail banks you'd actually see them, some of the people involved in these criminal conspiracies. And again, there's paper trail after paper trail of just high level bankers being involved in this stuff. And as long as they're working for those really big banks, none of those individuals actually go to prison. Some of them will lose a license or something like that. They might get some probation. Now, if they're working for some like much smaller financial institution, they might face like a really, small sentence or something like that. But at the end of the day, until you actually target that and take care of that issue, which I don't really foresee that ever happening just because money runs this country, the whole cryptocurrency is just kind of, to me, it's just I wouldn't say really a waste, because if you are really trying to stop the war on drugs and you are really trying to stop the dirty money, cryptocurrency is part of that. But let's just be real again. The biggest and worst perpetrators are the largest financial institutions throughout the world. And it's not just the United States. This is throughout all of the big financial, London, Hong Kong, like all of our strong allies economically are involved in this stuff, as well as our geopolitical rivals as well. Mm-hmm. But, it's just the big money. The worst perpetrators are never going to go down, I guess is my long-winded point there.
Well, at the end of the day, government is consists of people. People are subject to corruption. Corruption's going to run rampant the higher up you go. It's just a logical conclusion that these types of activities and things will continue to go on regardless of what laws are in the books. Because it's like you said, the big banker, they've got friends in Washington, and that's going to pretty much always be the case so long as the government remains the size that it is. And I don't see it shrinking, on its own volition.
Right. And I think some of it is these prosecutors, I think, well, this guy's not like a Pablo Escobar, man. He's not actually moving the drugs. And he was dirty and all this kind of stuff. But this is a white collar guy. He works with the desk and he wears a tie and all this kind of stuff, So I think there's some of that. But then the narrative just shifts. But, once it's become somebody with no real power, no real financial means, or I shouldn't say no real, but nothing on that level, suddenly you're serving some serious time.
Yeah, you are every bit the villain they're making you out to be.
Exactly.
You got no friends in media, no friends at in
Yep.
Washington. Yeah. And you see it time and time again. And I'm not trying to whip the dead horse. We all know, but and I'm not trying to single out one particular family with this, but I mean, look at Hunter Biden. You look at, how the media just like completely, and so did everybody else in Washington. I mean, it wasn't just the Dems, it was the Republicans too. I mean, that got dismissed quickly. However, if it was, somebody else on a much smaller scale and their son was, had pictures up and all that, my God, it's nonstop news coverage. I mean, it's, that person's life is inevitably ruined for the rest of their life. They're certainly not given an art gallery, at the behest of the president to, make some money on it. Again, not trying to whip a dead horse, but just kind of broadening, providing another exhibit to your example.
Wow.
With that, so you and I were talking about Gary Webb before, and I really wanted to kind of, because it sounds like you really understand or have a knowledge of, the Iran-Contra thing and that sort of affair. Am I off the mark in saying that not only will government look the other way whenever there's laundering involved, but they will actually sell these products in order to gain money in certain situations? Am I missing the mark on that?
I would slightly disagree, and it's sort of a matter of semantics.
Okay.
So you mentioned Gary Webb, right? So Gary Webb's expose, it ended up forcing the CIA Inspector General to again, issue a report. So basically what they showed was that several of their contractors and the State Department's contractors were drug traffickers. So again, we're talking about the CIA. We're not talking about you and me randomly looking on Google trying to find. They know who these people are. And yes, they absolutely facilitated the flow of drugs. And there's just time. I mean, I could give you example after example after example in which the CIA's assets were major prolific drug traffickers. Now, there are a lot of people who are really aware of this. You'll hear stuff, I'll call it CIA, the cocaine importation agency and stuff. And where I differ from a lot of those people is that they sort of look at these, and I can understand how somebody comes to that conclusion. I'm kind of, I guess, a little snobbish, and I say I've just looked into it probably more than most of those people. And my general conclusion is that, again, whenever the CIA is doing these types of things, it's really more of a matter of convenience and not intention. So what I mean by that, we look at, the Iran-Contra affair, right? So there was a revolution in Nicaragua. So the Somoza family was in there for decades, and then these radical leftist socialists took over the country. And you can look at our interventions throughout the world. We do not like that, and we will do everything we can to overturn that type of example, right? So the U.S. government funded the Contras, right? And they came from several different countries. We had several different allies trying to overthrow the Sandinistas, one of which was Manuel Noriega in Panama. So and I think you may have kind of a younger audience, so some of them, you'll know that name. But I think that the quickest and shortest summation that I can give you is he was a dictator of Panama, an absolute CIA puppet. He was on the payroll for several years. They knew that he was actively involved in drug trafficking, not him actually trafficking the drugs, but again, allowing the flow of drugs to go through his country, since you're very close to Colombia, one of the main source countries there, but also using the very laissez-faire banking laws in Panama to launder that money, right? And also a major arms trafficker. So, and again, a lot of arms trafficking, it's not the sort of official channels where a country buys from a certain, contractor, et cetera. There's a lot of, black market of these transfers, right? And Noriega was a big time part of that. So for several years, Noriega was our ally. But at one point there, he was our ally, but he was also a double dealer. So in other words, he was also in bed with Castro for quite a while as well. This guy was just all about just making money, right? So we have a lot of these different allies, et cetera. I'm trying to sum it up as short as I can.
No, you're good, man. You're doing great.
But long story short, so we're trying to overthrow this government in Nicaragua. We're using all of our allies there, and guess what? A lot of those Contras were major drug traffickers. So, and the evidence shows that, yeah, absolutely, the CIA absolutely facilitated the flow of drugs into the United States because that money then helped to fight their war. So some people can come to different conclusions. And again, you got to really dive into it, right? But my conclusion, again, is that it was not some part of some further conspiracy in which the CIA wanted the American public to be drugged and to be docile. And you'll hear those theories a lot. You start looking around the internet and stuff, you'll see stuff like that. I've just never seen the evidence that proves that. Because what I've seen is, again, it's just total hypocrisy, because when the United States has a rival and there's somebody out there, say like currently in Venezuela or something, there's a lot of drug corruption there, but we go and we crack down really hard. We try to do everything we can to use those drug laws. So in other words, my conclusion is more so that the drug war is sort of managed by the U.S. government, and we use it to our advantage to advance our goals. We will use it to overthrow governments that we view that are not an economic or military ally of ours. And we will also look the other way when a current example, say Honduras, where there's really just a really corrupt narco regime, but they're very friendly to the U.S. There was a coup back in 2009 that the U.S. supported, and it's just really been a horrible regime for over a decade now, with just a ton of corruption to the highest level. The current president, his brother, is in prison for like around 130 tons of cocaine.
It's a lot.
And in fact, the current president is an unindicted conspirator in that trial. He has just not been indicted. It's in the Southern District of Manhattan, Southern District of New York, which is Manhattan. But he's not, and you don't really see, you'll see the headlines a little bit. There is some press coverage about it, but it doesn't gain the same level of press coverage as, say, Venezuela. So sorry, let's circle back to like the 80s there and the Contras. But yeah, the general conclusion is, and my conclusion is, again, it's really more of a matter of convenience. It's not part of some darker conspiracy where I personally don't think, and even these CIA officials are trying to enrich themselves. They're using that money as off the books money to go and essentially advance the American empire. Because with the Contras there, they did try to pass that through Congress. Like, we were trying to fund these different missions. And guess what? Congress said, no, we're not. But what did the administration do? They're like, well, screw that. We're going to do this anyways. We're going to topple a government that we view as a rival and as an enemy. And we're going to do it no matter what the actual what the congressional reps actually do or don't. So that's where so much of the that whole scandal, that's the inner part. And what did get lost a lot was the actual drug angle. That was part of it. Everybody was aware of the weapons transfers, with Iran, but the drug part was not. There was some press coverage at the time. I was a young boy then, so I didn't know that stuff until I read later. But then you fast forward to about 96, this California reporter named Gary Webb started a report on it, found some other, he just coincidentally shows up to a local court case. And then the guy's just one hell of an investigative journalist and just uncovers different roles and more evidence linking the CIA with the drug trade and the Iran-Contra affair. And ultimately, I think one of the angles you wanted to go into was his actual death. Is that one of the things you wanted to approach there? Or?
I mean, yeah, we absolutely can. I think I'm glad that you provided, before we get into that, I'm glad that you provided that kind of explanation, because that goes in line with kind of what I was thinking, is that these agencies will crack down on you in a second but only if your activities are not benefiting them in one way, shape, or form. So the CIA had no problem turning a blind eye to what their assets were doing because it was benefiting them because their mission was being done. But the guy, and the local guy who's, trafficking in however much dope and selling it on the streets, like they're not doing anything for any of the local agencies. So yeah, they're going to get jammed up.
Right. So that exact point there, and I forgot to circle back to it, General Noriega. So again, I'm of an age of, I remember when we made a big deal about, we went down to Panama. He became the face of illegal drug trafficking and a corrupt narco regime. But again, the U.S. media at the time was not talking about, well, gee, wasn't he our ally for several, like over a decade? Like, and suddenly this guy became public enemy number one. And really, it's exactly what you just referred to there. He was a double dealer, and then he actually started to shift more to the left. He became more attached to the Sandinistas, literally doing some public appearances at some of their speeches and stuff. And then just suddenly, stories get leaked in the press. Seymour Hersh is the one who breaks the story about, and it just some very convenient leaks and some very convenient timing that suddenly then Noriega becomes the face of the war on drugs. And we got to send in U.S. troops to topple this guy because just the threat is so bad. Now, once he's no longer more than 50% loyal to us, now we're going to use, again, it's, we're going to go after him. And again, this is because, he's a corrupt narco dictator there.
Sounds like oddly reminiscent of what recently transpired in Venezuela. Like, it seemed like that was really the main dig that I saw Trump doing when he was still in office. They were talking about sending, battleships down there and, this and that, because, we're going to start, really fighting this war on drugs again. And that was the whole perceived thing behind it was, X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. Because Venezuela now is a major rival of ours. There's just tremendous hypocrisy with that. So, that change, Hugo Chavez is the one who got that ball rolling there. The U.S., at a minimum, tacitly supported one of the coup attempts against him back in, was that 2000? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact year. But again, this stuff ties back to the war on drugs. I know some of your audience will be familiar with the term the School of Americas. Have you heard that term before? The
Yes.
School of Americas? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So, but just for the audience who isn't, a lot of people kind of refer to the School of Americas as the School of the Coup, because I made a pretty crass tweet the other day, basically saying if Vegas had betting odds on coups that take place in Latin America and the Caribbean, you could print money betting on the School of Americas. So long story short, we have a military base in Georgia that was formerly known as the School of Americas. It's now WINSEC, the Western Hemispheric something or other, some really bland name to kind of launder the reputation of that organization. But long story short, you can pretty much point it out. Almost every coup that takes place in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is always the perpetrators. And I'm not saying that every one of the perpetrators, but usually the ringleaders behind it were trained on U.S. soil at the School of Americas. And the reason why I say that it's drug related is, again, what we were talking about earlier in this conversation of how terrorism and these types of things in the drug war are interchangeable. So the School of Americas, it's technically supposed to be for counter narcotics training, is where these cadets from all of these different countries come, and they come to the U.S. so they learn counter narcotics training. But in the process, it just seems to be this amazing coincidence that whenever these coups take place, they were trained at the School of Americas. And again, this recent the assassination in Haiti, like 4 of the members on that team there were trained at the School of Americas. I don't know if you had any interest in that. We could kind of dive into.
Hell yeah, man.
My God, where do I start? Okay.
I'm sorry. I hope you don't feel like I'm holding you hostage, but man,
I love this.
this
I
is
could
what I'm
I can
about.
this is what I love, man. I love when I appreciate you reaching out, because this is the stuff I love to talk about. I wish I had more time to just kind of create content, but you do a good job of just teeing me up, because I can rant forever. So let's talk Haiti, right?
Okay.
So the recent assassination, this was a U.S. puppet, by the way, who was killed. This wasn't some sort of opposition guy, right? But there's just so much history with Haiti, several other countries in this hemisphere, in which, again, the drug war is sort of our Trojan horse for advancing the American empire. So what happened recently? Obviously, this president, most people are aware of that the president of Haiti was assassinated, right?
Mhm.
First of all, they're able to enter his home saying DA, DA. So then, the guard, I mean, again, this is the official story. We don't, 100% know all of the truth and all the facts at this point. But what we do know is that most of these guys were actually former Colombian military. Guess what? There's this massive war industry essentially in Colombia. A lot of that, again, is a direct result of the war on drugs. There's a term called Plan Colombia. Late in the 90s, in the Clinton administration, our government said we have just got to toss all kinds of guns and weaponry and training to the country of Colombia. We are going to arm these people. We're going to put all of our weaponry behind this to try to stop the flow of cocaine in Colombia. So long story short, Colombia has always been one of the top producers of cocaine. That took, we started doing that. It's been over tens of billions of dollars have gone to that country, arming them. And the flow of cocaine, the supply of cocaine has only increased then. We're pretty much at record levels of cocaine production in Colombia. And essentially what we did there, I know this is probably like, what the hell does that have to do with Haiti?
No.
I promise. I'm getting there, I promise. But what's happened is we were really using, and again, I'm kind of oversimplifying it, but we were using a lot of this counter narcotics funding in Colombia to really sort of fight a neo-Cold War. Because in Colombia at the time, and it's still essentially going on, there's like a 50-year civil war in Colombia. So the Cold War officially ended, late 80s there. But ever since, there still are militant communist groups in the world. It's a very small fringe, but one of the strongest groups was this group called the FARC. These communist rebels who did want to overthrow the government of Colombia. And Colombia is a very potent geopolitical ally of ours. There's a lot of natural resources there, gold, oil, etc. And they're in good standing with. They're a very firm military ally of ours. So the actual real politics behind this stuff is America's like, we're not letting another Nicaragua happen here, where some communist rebels overthrow the government. So what's happened in Colombia is they're again targeting, because both sides, you've got these like right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia who are really just protecting the government and the big business interests. They're deeply involved in the cocaine trade. And there's also those left-wing communist guerrillas involved in the cocaine trade. So guess which side we've put those efforts into tackling. We've put it in all to go after the money that's attached to the communist rebels there. And meanwhile, I'm not saying that none of the right-wing paramilitaries got busted, but none of the real people in power. That includes the former president of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe. And he still really kind of quietly runs the country, has a whole ton of influence. And this guy is deeply tied to the narco trade. So why I was tying that, Colombia to Haiti is, first of all, again, most of the people involved in that assassination are the ex-military. They're now private contractors, because we've pumped so much money and guns and weaponry and training into Colombia. If you look at just different mercenary forces throughout the country, a lot of them are Colombian. They only have so much time. They go into the actual military, and then they go for the real money, which is then in contracting, right? So most of those individuals are Colombian, right? The company that they were working for was CTU Security. I'm drawing a blank on, I forgot his name. This expat Venezuelan there in Miami who owns the company. This guy was also behind. Do you remember those freedom concerts on the border of Venezuela and Colombia? Do you remember that stuff a few years back?
Yeah.
That guy was the security guy for those concerts there. So this is a politically connected individual there. You know, those freedom concerts were our ways of looking to see if we can get in there and try to overthrow Venezuela, or at least put some pressure on Venezuela. So this same guy, his security company, was involved in this assassination there, or his people were, let's just say, involved in the assassination there in Haiti. So long story short, the U.S., so there's that tie. We've essentially just been, through the drug war, we've been exporting war and violence and our geopolitical agenda for several years. And it has many different negative consequences. But now, with that said, that's kind of wanted to, like, let's just, if you don't mind, I want to kind of talk a little bit about Haiti and the drug war's role there.
Yeah.
So I would say at best, and this is where I'm speculating, I would think that U.S. intelligence at least had some idea that this was going to happen. You know, somebody who's is politically connected like that, providing the security in that role. Let's just say, and maybe I'm a jerk for saying, but I think that the U.S. intelligence at least had some awareness of this.
Had to have
happened. Let's just say that at a minute. I always want to err on the side of conservative.
Okay.
I just don't like going too far down speculation lane.
Right.
But what we can say is, let me kind of give the audience just a little brief background on Haiti and some areas that I think most people are not really aware of. So the U.S. has just had undue influence in that country for a long time, and the drug war has kind of been sort of some of the pretense, right? So Haiti, 1803, it's the first country in this hemisphere, other than the United States, to actually, a former slave state, to actually assert its independence. They actually had to buy their independence from France, right? So the first actual democratically elected leader was a guy named Aristide. That happened in 1991, right? But before then, there were actually CIA officials back in the 80s. They were testifying before Congress saying, well, yes, we have been funding certain opposition politicians. Like, we're openly trying to get our guy elected in Haiti. You know, so I mean, remember, the prior election, all stuff, this kind of stuff about talking with, the integrity of elections and no foreign money.
Right.
Here's the CIA talking about, we're literally funding these different guys. We're not going to tell you who. We're not going to tell you who, but we can tell you for damn sure it was not Aristide. So Aristide was a very left of center guy. He was, again, the first democratically elected official in that country. Again, we're talking about a very poor country. I know it's a libertarian audience, but that very leftist socialist message is very popular in a lot of these countries, that the government will actually help you, to try to help you out, bring you out of poverty, et cetera. So he's who was elected there, right? Not long into his time in office, he is overthrown in a military coup that was backed by the CIA. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Cedras. I'm trying to remember his name. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. It's Raul Cedras, right? So he becomes the new president there in Haiti. Long record of corruption with drug trafficking. Basically installs this new intelligence apparatus with the acronym SIN. Again, all attached to the CIA. What happens in those next 3 years after the democratically elected leader is put into place? It's just horrific. Thousands and thousands of people murdered by government forces. This is all, again, with CIA support. So ultimately, this guy Cedras is eventually, the situation's gotten so bad, the PR is so bad, he's got to go. Right? We got to put Aristide back in there. Right? This guy gets an official escort from the U.S. military to Panama. And we're not talking some, poor part of town. We're talking Panama City, and as posh of the circumstances as you can possibly get, with all this dirty drug money. U.S. government actually leases some of his properties there in Haiti, gives him the full, and he gets this like diplomatic treatment for a guy who is behind one of the most brutal regimes, in modern history. He has a guy who's really the head of his intelligence apparatus, a guy, Emmanuel Constant. They basically had this paramilitary force. Again, just if there was just any thought that you were against the government, they were going out and murdering you. And by the way, again, with the support of the CIA. And again, this whole regime was, again, heavily involved in drug trafficking. So this guy, Constant, who I'm referring to, instead of going to prison or The Hague or anything, he goes to the United States. He lives in New York City. He's provided safe haven. And ultimately, he does go to prison. He does not go to prison for any of the violent crimes. He's not a drug guy. He actually goes to the bank, to prison for bank fraud. He was involved in some of these real estate scams and ripping off the banks. That's what he actually goes to prison for. That's what the United States. You rip off the banks, then you're in trouble. You can murder. You can be behind the murder of roughly around 3,000 Haitian people just expressing their free speech, etc. That you don't go to prison for, and that you were provided safe haven. So, long story short, 1994 comes around, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it was like. Operation Uphold Democracy. Of all the hypocrisy in this stuff, we let Aristide, the democratically elected leader of Haiti, to come back to his own country, where he was actually elected. And then, because it had gotten so bad, the PR at this point, we had supported this coup. It had just gotten out of hand. At this point, we got a little egg on our face. Clinton's like, all right, we're restoring democracy. Oh, and by the way, you're only allowed to come back if you follow certain rules that we want. We want you to go along with these IMF loans. You're going to follow our economic policy that we deem is correct for your country. So long story short, guess what? He is uprooted again. Aristide, a second coup takes place in 2004. Again, we implement another stooge. He's like a former UN guy. What was I going to say? But yeah, I mean, he's, again, U.S. Marines take him off to the Central African Republic. But again, the U.S. has just had their hands in this country for so long. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring up, there's a specific example that's always stuck out in my head. So when that coup regime was in place, to kind of give you, I think, a decent picture of how this drug war really works, is the head of the DA, if I remember, his last name was Greco. He literally received like this threatening phone call because the guy's trying to do his job. He's a DEA guy, right? There's drugs flowing through this country like crazy. He knows there's corruption, et cetera. He basically receives this threatening call, like, if you don't stop what you're doing, you're dead. You're straight up dead. And they end up tracing the call, and it was to one of the highest level, generals in the country, again, tied to the CIA there. So there's compartmentalization, I guess you should say. So it's not like there's some grand conspiracy where everybody's in on it. No, it's just there's certain key people and certain key points. But I guess the point I was really just trying to make is that so much of this unrest, people aren't aware of. Like that's what we did, and we used this war on drugs. And there's just total hypocrisy with that. Further, and subsequent leaders there in that country, have been tied, to some level of corruption. Martelly there. I remember reading some story. It shows him on a yacht with like this businessman who's like pretty strong suspicions that he's tied to the drugs and all that kind of stuff. But again, this is a guy who's a U.S. ally, who, by the way, again, he's former president there, like within a week before this recent assassination, who did do some filings, or I shouldn't say filings, actually started to pay the money for U.S. lobbyists, again, to sort of scrub his reputation. Whether that's a coincidence, whether it's not, again, I'm not accusing the guy. Again, we got to be very careful as far as our speculation, but that is a pretty crazy coincidence that a week before this assassination, And just so you know how the Haitian laws work, you can't go a subsequent, or maybe I'm remembering that wrong. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this right, but you can't go a subsequent term. But if there's a term in between, then you can go back into power type of a thing.
I got you.
But keep in mind, again, what a lot of people forget is that this Moisey guy was really, again, he was a U.S. puppet. Part of a lot of this unrest that you've seen in Haiti is again, he was really trumpeting a lot of the policies of the United States. He was actually assassinated on the anniversary 3 years prior. Basically, what he did was Venezuela had this agreement where they gave highly subsidized oil to Haiti. And what the U.S. did and the IMF, so like, we don't want you doing that anymore. You're going to have to raise the price of oil, and you're going to have to go through, essentially our system. Guess what? Riots. It's a very poor country. You raise the price of oil tremendously overnight in a country that's just where people are really struggling. You're going to have some angry people.
Yeah.
But long story short, this guy was a puppet. Horrible, horrible human rights abuses, where gang leaders are literally going in to certain areas of sort of political violence. They go in and just assassinate people like 50, 70 at a time.
Jesus, man.
And again, this is a guy who had all the support, of the United States. And again, just example after example of these people who are tied to the drug trade. And again, we overlook all this stuff until it's no longer convenient for us. But I know that was one of your original questions, like what my interpretation is again, I don't view it as really like CIA officials enriching themselves. I don't view it that way at all. I haven't come across that evidence. But what it does is when you've got that dirty money, that allows you to do the black bag jobs. It allows you to do these sort of shadowy operations, and you're able to try to overthrow governments or prop up the corrupt leaders that you like because there's a certain agenda behind it. And you can do all this stuff without congressional authorization. You don't need the funds. You can operate and do whatever the heck you want. And if you're on that kind of a power trip, a lot of times you just say, damn be the results. We're going to put our guy in this country. That's the general takeaway, I would say.
Let me just make sure that I'm understanding this right. So the
Haitian,
I
threw a lot at you, man.
Hey, it's all good, brother. It's all good. But this is wild to me. So that not only the Haitian president was a puppet of the United States, but the people who went in and killed him more or less had pretty strong ties, at least in the current sense. So certainly, and where they were trained in Colombia, but almost an immediate sense as well. So it's almost like it seems twofold, man. Like what do you have any speculation that you'd feel like throwing out there to try to explain like why this happened?
I really don't know. And it puzzles me because a lot of times these things are really obvious. A lot of times they're really obvious, and I'm just missing something there. But a lot of times, again, it just comes down to, in my opinion, sort of a matter of convenience. Like, again, we go back to the Noriega example. This was somebody who was our guy, but then something changed. And I'm not really an expert on Haiti. I know, again, I know Haiti through really the lens of a lot of the drugs and the corruption stuff. That's what I follow. But if you get really deep into the Haitian politics, I can't tell you much other than what I've recently researched, trying to look for that, because it did puzzle me. I'm like, because when it happened, that was my first immediate instinct when I heard that. I was like, damn, this guy's a U.S. puppet. That's odd. And I was thinking, oh, well, maybe this was just because, again, there was rioting and unrest in that country for quite a while. This was a deeply, deeply unpopular guy who, by the way, really all evidence shows took office on a fraudulent election, which the United States supported. So this was a guy who a lot of people wanted dead. And my immediate instinct is, wow, it looks like maybe just, something like that happened. I mean, this is a deeply unpopular guy. But then when you start seeing the details come out, again, two of the U.S. guys, they're, again, Florida, Miami guys, a lot of this stuff. You look at Cuba and a lot of the Colombian stuff, when we're doing a lot of this regime change stuff, Miami kind of is sort of an epicenter for it. So, but yeah, there were two Haitian Americans involved, one of which was a former, U.S. Marine. And again, the military can't be responsible for every person who's opening the doors.
Right.
But I was the thing that really, when I found that news, where again, the School of America's part wasn't really surprising, but even still then, I'm like, some of this can be coincidental. But the thing that really did intrigue me was, again, and let me pull up my notes here real quick. Hang on a second. Yes. Yeah. Tony Intriago. When that name came up, then I was like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. Because again, he's the same guy who, again, was involved in those freedom concerts there along the Colombian and Venezuelan border. And then I'm like, again, you just don't. I also don't want to get sued by the guy either. But I mean, let's be real. Like, I have, like, that was just a red flag in my mind. And again, I was trying to be really concise because there's so many different things we want to talk about, but there's just so much history with the United States and Haiti, and just our ties and our just, the term influence doesn't do it justice. Like, let's just say it's far beyond influence that the United States has had in that country. So that's why I was saying, at a minimum, I just find it hard to believe that the U.S. intelligence community didn't have knowledge of that going down. I mean, this guy, again, he was strongly tied to the U.S. intelligence apparatus. There was a story about 2 years ago. You may not know it. I imagine some of your listeners are probably have heard this story. It was on The Intercept. It's just kind of one of these things that kind of got swept under the rug. But long story short, some U.S. contractors were down there in Haiti, like heavily armed, and they're making this random trip to a Haitian bank. And essentially what is believed to be the case is that they were supposed to help the president embezzle something like $80 million of like public funds into his personal account. Long story short, different, government officials intercept these guys. They're taken into custody. Like, these are guys who are supposed to be looking at some pretty harsh penalties. They're sent home to the U.S. No penalty, no jail time, no nothing from these, pretty, connected U.S. security contractors. So there's just so much stuff there, in which, again, the U.S. has just had their tentacles in this country that just deserves to just be left the hell alone. But yeah, so that's why, I just kind of I want to watch my words until I really know more.
Yeah.
But
and more will come out, obviously, as time goes on.
Yeah. But at a minimum, we just need to leave this damn country alone. My main takeaway is, well, guess what? When these things happen, what is the response that typically mainstream, and not the libertarian community, but what mainstream America says? We got to bring in the troops.
Yeah,
get in there and stabilize that country. And it's like, that is the last damn thing that country needs. Again, that was part of why. I know I'm pretty sure, like, your audience, like, we know it's libertarian, but it's like, maybe there's some people who are outside of that libertarian circle who are listening to this episode, and just to try to give them a little different perspective that, no, absolutely not. I don't want U.S. troops in that country. I want that country to try to have its own reconciliation, go through its own process. I want us, let's let them run their country. That's what I want. That's what I want.
Without a doubt. It sounds like, when it comes to foreign drug policy, it's a healthy mixture of blunder and calculated, deviancy, on behalf of government agency. And, at government efficiency at its finest, screwing up at a healthy click. It just sounds like a lot of this stuff gets away from us. You just look at how you broke down the Iran-Contra affair, Noriega, and, what happened with all of that. And then we see what's happening in Haiti right now. It's just, after you've meddled in geopolitics to that level for so long, and you've spent so much money training, militant, armies or cells or whatever you want to call it, like, you're going to have blowback. It's not avoidable. And at this point, it's like, man, like, there's going to be some comeuppance, and when this stuff eventually winds up on U.S. soil, because I think it will. I really do think it will,
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, and this is what's so tragic in my mind, is that most of the rest of the world knows these kinds of things. It's that the average American does not know so much of this stuff. In my opinion, let me give you what I think is a pretty cool example like that. So, yeah, again, it's not really so much blunder. A lot of this stuff is sort of by design. So, the name Evo Morales, for example, the former president of Bolivia. So if anybody's not, fully aware of the guy, extremely left of center, socialist, very, again, so we still really, again, the Cold War officially ended, but in many ways it's still kind of taking place just in a softer sense. We're no longer, supporting, these dirty wars that kill thousands and thousands of people, but we're still involved in some very aggressive stuff, right? So the reason why I bring up that name, and just sort of like, when you go outside of America, like how much the average person realizes just how involved the United States is in the view of America. So yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily blowback, but at least in the current terms, the average person worldwide knows a lot more about this stuff than we do. So the reason why I brought up Evo Morales is, so this guy, he's again the former president. He was recently ousted. What was at the end of 2019 in a coup, led by a general who was a former graduate of the School of Americas. And there's some kind of convenient narrative there. The U.S. did not like this guy. He's a left of center guy. We want leaders in these countries who will let our corporations go in there and extract their resources with basically no taxes, bring it all back to the U.S. That's what, in general, the United States wants. They don't want a leftist leader like that who forces like the Exxons of the world and stuff to pay big old taxes to pull those resources out of there. So he was ousted in a coup. But the reason why I was bringing him up is early on in his time there, this is a guy who's a former coca grower. So Bolivia is one of the largest producers of cocaine in the world, but there is a legal use for coca as well. Some people use it as chewing. It's very much a cultural thing there in Bolivia. But let's also be real. A lot of that stuff ends up turning into cocaine, right? So I've always felt that there was a touch of a nudge and a wink there with him. I never viewed him. I never saw real evidence of him, enriching himself from the cocaine trade or the really direct ties and corruption for him. A lot of the corruption in that country, it's, on the lower level, in my opinion. It's just different officials allowing this stuff to take place. But where I was trying to go with this is, at one point, he actually kicked the DEA out of his country, right? So really, then he becomes, just public enemy, number one there. But what he did was he literally held up this book. It was called The Big White Lie. And it was written by a guy named Michael Levine. He's he's a really high-level DEA official. And this guy, in my opinion, is the highest level DEA whistleblower out there. And the average American does not know his name, his story, any of this stuff. So let me just give you the real brief background on Michael Levine and why he spoke out so much. So he's super high level, super successful DEA agent, right? And he eventually gets into Bolivia. This is, a ways back, because Colombia is now like the top producer, but for quite a while there, Bolivia was. And at one point, Bolivia did have sort of a puppet regime that was very loyal to the United States. There was what was informally known as the cocaine coup that took place back in the 80s there, where, again, CIA assisted a guy, and some of this stuff, it's going to sound like I'm crazy guy talking. It's like you just kind of have to go in there and verify what I'm talking about. A guy named Klaus Barbie, a former Nazi war criminal who the CIA, after it kind of used in different roles, he was a part of that coup. So what happened was we had this sort of right-wing, very U.S.-friendly narco regime in place in Bolivia. This guy named Roberto Suarez was basically the world's biggest drug trafficker at the time, the biggest producer of cocaine. And he was deeply tied to this right-wing government in Bolivia that was very friendly with the United States. So the reason I'm giving that background is this guy, Michael Levine, eventually goes in there and infiltrates them. And he starts to build up what can be real cases that can actually take this guy down, and we can go after him. Instead of that happening, they attack Michael Levine. He basically writes about all this stuff in the book, making the point that they actually came after him rather than Roberto Suarez. There was one point in the book that's, again, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's just always stuck out. And he makes this point, and he goes, every single nickel and dime bag drug dealer in America is within the DEA's database. But the biggest drug trafficker at the time, Roberto Suarez, was not. And his whole inner circle was not. And the point being that, again, there's just sort of this compartmentalization that the DEA, you've got the rank and file people, but if you get to a certain point and there's certain people who are these U.S. allies, the national security state sort of kicks in there and says, okay, well, this is our protected guy. And Michael Levine's been talking about this stuff for decades now, and not a whole lot of attention. I always try to give the reference of, because it's kind of like a pop culture reference. Anybody who's watched Scarface, because you mentioned this very early in when we started talking, like a lot of this stuff is out there, and I'm like, you betcha, a lot of this stuff is out there. And what I mean by that is Oliver Stone was alluding to that in the movie Scarface. So there's this scene where there's this Bolivian drug trafficker, and there's this like hanger-on guy they're kind of inferring that he's with the CIA and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if you've watched Scarface.
Yeah.
It was very subtle. You have to watch. I've watched the movie several times, and that's when I'm like, oh, I didn't catch it. Like, I was too young when I watched it to really understand the significance. But the point of what I was saying is that a lot of this stuff is out there. It's just that media doesn't really connect the dots and all that kind of stuff. Like when I was talking about Haiti, for example, they don't really connect the dots. So like New York Times drops a story and mentions that so-and-so, a general from Haiti, is tied to the drug trade. But then they'll do another story and somebody else writes a story that, hey, by the way, this certain general is tied to the CIA. But not in the same article. You're not getting the same context and really delivering what the real news that should be.
Right. Right.
But yeah, so my point being that, I don't know if it's necessarily blowback in the form of, say, like terrorism or anything, but it's already out there. Like the reputation for many people in the world really know the true colors, at least of our foreign policy. And I think it's a shame, because I think it's a privilege to be born in the United States. I've traveled to different countries and all that stuff. I know it's far from a perfect country, but I'm really thankful. I'm very thankful to live in this country, even though, like I said, there's a lot of things that need to be improved. And I think that domestically, again, it's a pretty darn good country. But what we export as far as our foreign policy is just absolutely awful. Correct. And that's why I really try to focus on the drug work, because again, it really kind of is a Trojan horse for us to just do some really awful stuff and really try to exert our influence on the world. And again, because it's just sort of innocuous. Oh, it's the war on drugs. You got to bust these guys, and we got to send we've got about 4,000 U.S. troops in Latin America. Like, do you really view what country in Latin America do you view as like an actual national security threat to the United States? It's about empire. It's about empire. And that's how, we get these bases throughout the world. And then we say, we're providing counter narcotics training. Part of what I was also saying sorry, a little long winded there, but with the Evo Morales example, where he's holding up that book and when he kicked out the country, was also just pointing out that the DEA is also, it's an intelligence agency. It's not just performing counter narcotics. Like, so when they're going into these countries, they are an intelligence agency as well. There's a lot of agendas there going on.
Now, have you watched the Narcos series on Netflix? And
I did. I've enjoyed it. And even the creators will tell you that it's not 100% accurate. There are certain points where I'm like, damn, like, because I think that they really draw some really good storylines and kind of point to some things, like I've sort of, I'm actually glad you brought that up. So like one of the things I was always very frustrated with is that you'll hear the name Pablo Escobar and they'll kind of say like it's cool. Like, yeah, man, there's some people who have like a sort of rebellious connection with a guy like that. And when they actually saw all the violence associated with this guy, like that term narco terrorism in some instances, even though he's, I mean, in his, I mean, you can argue that like that's narco terrorism. I mean, you know, like that really is the case.
Blowing up a passenger airplane, you know,
right. Yeah. I mean, I mean, and just all of the violence associated with that guy, like, let's not, and I think that's really one of the real problems as well. Cause I do tend to harp on, like I said, the foreign policy stuff, but it's like one of the things that's always broken my heart, I think it's probably something near and dear to you. One of these aspects to the war on drugs is sort of like this rebellious kind of counterculture aspect to it. And I'm not saying that that's all bad, but it really just kind of goes too far. And that there are a lot of people who don't trust the government, who don't like the government. And then when you get some of these sort of individuals like a Pablo Escobar, like they just kind of lose track of it. Or El Chapo and all these different people who are horrible, horrible human beings, but they kind of, you know, we like the rebel, you know, and the old mafia movies and all this kind of stuff. And we kind of identify with that counterculture. And it's like, maybe you guys need to read a little bit more about who these individuals are and like what they actually do. Really some awful stuff. And again, this counterproductive, you know, the criminalization of these different things like drugs creates that, you know, that's something that's always bothered me, at least as far as domestically, is I feel like it really draws a lot of people into like a life of crime. What I mean by that is, I mean, that part's obvious, right? So that allure of the money, right? Because, you know, in a lot of people's minds, it's like, okay, well, the drug part, that's a consensual crime. Right. And if you notice, I never use that term victimless crime because let's be real. You know, if somebody has drug addiction and all the things that kind of go along, I view them as a victim, but it is consensual crime. Right. So some person can kind of get wrapped up into this stuff and they need the money and all of that. But then once you've kind of gone into this criminal world, it just opens up a whole nother level of like deviance. Whereas, you know, alcohol is legal. You know, if somebody has an alcohol problem, you know, we say, hey, that person needs help, right? But if somebody has an addiction to heroin or meth or cocaine, we call them a crackhead, we call them a meth head, we call them a junkie, and we feel like they need to get locked up. And it just creates so much negativity. Whereas we could just come from like a harm reduction, you know, point of view. And I think that's kind of been more of your focus, right? It seems like that's really, right.
Yeah, that's the whole rub behind. Here's the thing is that I will advocate for recreational black tar heroin, but I will not advocate for the use of recreational black tar heroin. There's a stark difference in between those two camps. And, you know, the work that you're doing is very nuanced, detail oriented. Like you have done a lot of research and it's awesome work you're doing. Kind of the angle where I come from is I provide what I believe to be the ultimate solution to addiction, which is organic recovery that is divorced from the state entirely. And, you know, we, in my opinion, you know, we have the solution to this war on drugs sitting right in front of us here in the States. You know, you see it in your local church 2 or 3 nights a week. You know, it's not hard to find. The solution's there.
I'm curious, like, have you seen, so there's a recent news with Rhode Island where they've now, the governor has given it the thumbs up where you have the supervised injection facilities. I was kind of curious, like, what your thoughts are on that. I'm a proponent of it. I'm not, because it's complex and it's like we kind of have to look at it in several angles. I was kind of curious your thoughts on that.
So with any of that, like I am all about harm reduction. I'm all about injection sites. I'm all about giving a tangible avenue for people to get recovery or rehabilitation whenever they look for it. My big hitch and where I kind of hit a wall, and especially what you're talking about in Rhode Island, is how is that being funded? If you're making the guy across town who's never smoked a joint pay for this treatment or safe injection site across town, you're not doing anything to bridge the gap of compassion and understanding.
Right.
You know, you're causing more of a resentment. So that would be my one hesitation on it. But if we can offer an avenue, and like the listeners of this podcast and some other people on Liberty Twitter kind of got together and we raised over like $700 for Narcan doses for a local needle exchange here in Oklahoma. So like, I'm all about that, it's just the funding of it, man.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. And that's, I'm glad you brought that up. And again, I'm pretty sure it's like 100% a libertarian audience, right? When you got that in your name, I'm just hoping, wishing, praying there's somebody who's like, maybe like where they're bordering on that, right? So they're a little bit out there, and then maybe we can change some minds. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I'm of a similar boat. But again, I'm less libertarian than you are. I do believe in like some government spending and all that. But guess what? In this instance, this is all privately funded. So there's just a ton of evidence. And I'm assuming you probably talked about this stuff quite a bit. I'm hoping maybe we catch somebody, a first-time listener or something. I mean, there's over 100 countries throughout the world where there's variations of these types of facilities. It allows somebody who has a heroin addiction, an opioid addiction, to go in there, first of all, so that they're not doing this stuff out in the streets. Like, imagine if your kids, you're walking around, you see, somebody like shooting up, and like, it's just not a good thing for society in general. This is like, so let's kind of like, what's the better term I'm looking for? Nonetheless, so somebody goes in there, you can get tested for HIV, you get tested for hepatitis, you're going to get a clean needle. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to reduce the spread of diseases. So we're going to create some positive for society on that, right? And let's just kind of remember the whole point, or at least the express point of this war on drugs is we're trying to prevent people from doing drugs, right? We don't, because I'm with you. I'm not one of these people, when I say I'm for ending the war on drugs, sometimes people think it's like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or something. Like, I'm a pretty straight-laced guy too. The only drug I do is like a beer or two during college football season. Like, that's my only drug. Like, I'm nothing. Like, I'm not trying to do this for some like personal agenda, some like rebellious kind of thing, right? But the whole point, at least I think in most people's minds, is that we need these laws against drugs to stop the people from doing the drugs. And we've got over 100 years of evidence to show that it has not been effective, right? So we're going about it. We're trying, with these facilities, we're just trying to go about this in a different way that reduces some of the harms to society that come along with this drug usage. So I'm of the belief, that's why I was trying to give that example. It's something I've always said when we have this conversation is, again, if you said, oh, Johnny over there, he's got an alcohol problem. A lot of times people say, well, we got to get him help, right? Versus, again, if we said so-and-so's got a cocaine problem, I got a meth problem, I got a heroin problem, the usual reaction is not that way. Or it's getting better, but it's like, oh my God, these junkies or these meth heads, you got to watch out for them, right? Like, there's like that kind of a narrative. And what we do is a lot of these people, a lot of them are homeless or borderline that way. They're really kind of on the outskirts of society. And by creating these kind of facilities, it's like, no, we're bringing you back into society, right? And we don't expect you to quit this thing overnight, but we're going to treat you like a human being. We're going to treat you with some dignity, and we're going to give you the resources with no judgment to try to help you to overcome this problem. And it's not like this is some new revolutionary idea. That's why I mentioned, we're talking over 100 cities throughout the world, mostly in Europe, some in Canada, your more liberal countries. And they've been experimenting with various forms of these kinds of policies. And it is very effective. I mean, again, there's no foolproof. There's always going to be heroin addiction and cocaine addiction, et cetera. But it is very effective as far as reducing, not eliminating, but reducing the spread of different diseases, and also getting these people to treatment. And again, to me, it's just such a common sense thing. And it's just so frustrating So, for example, like I said, Rhode Island, this just happened recently, but one of these facilities tried to start up. I think it was like about 2 years ago in Philadelphia. It's a different one in Seattle. The one in Philadelphia, they fought in the courts for quite a while. Earlier this year, just the court just said, nope, you can't do it. And I wish I knew a little more about the details of the case, because it just, I'm like, really? Well, can you give me I guess there's a legal reason, but in my opinion, there's not a logical reason.
No.
I do understand why people freak out about it. Like, I get it, because they have not read this information. They have not had that presented to them. It sounds crazy because culturally we're very different here in the United States than some of these other countries. But what I do really try to get out there is, again, these are not new ideas. It's actually very time tested. We're talking over a couple of decades. Like, Switzerland was one of the first. I mean, they had a lot of different experiments that they tried. Some of them were really bad. Like, one of the experiments was just straight up totally laissez-faire, like public areas. Like, yeah, guys, go shoot it up, do whatever you want. Yeah, there'll be like some NGO workers. It ended up being like counterproductive, because it was just like, we're going total rebellion here. There's end up being actually increasing crime, outside of the drugs and stuff like that. And then that was sort of the natural response was, okay, let's try to clean this up a little bit. We'll bring them indoors. We'll get these people access. We're going to make it less of like the party scene, I guess, for the lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And sort of just view this for what it is. This is a harmful addiction that people need some help with. And again, just treating some people with some dignity. And again, it is very effective. And God, I wish that we could this needed to happen decades ago.
Yeah.
That's why I am thrilled with what happened in Rhode Island, but barely even a register in the news. And it's like, this is something that really can actually create some very effective change. We're seeing a real change in the narrative. Like you said, you mentioned Hunter Biden there. One of the things that's always driven me up the wall was, again, the hypocrisy, like the Bushes and stuff. You start to see that when some of their family members got caught in some of this stuff. Then the term compassionate conservatism came about, and then it's like, oh well, when it hits home with us, now maybe we need to look at these drug laws and reevaluate, how all this stuff works.
Yeah, man.
And again, you saw the narrative there. Again, Biden, who was a big time. I mean, he was pretty much a Republican when it came to drug laws. Like, he was right at center of most of the Republicans when it came to the drug laws. But now, a lot of compassion for his son, and he's so proud of him, And again, it's like, why couldn't you have, developed that before it affected you personally?
Right.
And I do get how some of the people really did want to see, this war on drug and crackdown, because, you see the crime in the streets and you see the guys on the corner. But again, they're just not connecting the dots that, we've been through this road before with the prohibition of alcohol. And again, the criminalization is just not how you end this stuff. It's treating with some dignity. I'm kind of curious. So what are your thoughts as far as, like, if you could write a drug policy for America, like what are your thoughts? I'm kind of curious.
Decriminalization. I would,
not legalization.
Yeah, not legalization. Here's the reason why. And I used to be firmly in the legalization camp.
Are you talking about for everything, or are you lumping marijuana in that category as well? Okay.
Everything. And when I say decriminalization, I mean a new libertarian decriminalization. What I mean by that is every aspect of that substance, the retail, the use, the possession, the production, the transportation, every single aspect decriminalized.
Right.
The reason being is because, and you're seeing it in these states that legalize. You're seeing it in Florida. I had Martha Bueno on. She was talking to me about like the barrier for entry just to get into that market for medical marijuana in Florida. It's just ridiculous. You're seeing it here in Oklahoma. We got some friends of ours who they've been running a grow, and they're going to have to get out of the business because of some new legislation that came through. Like, they can't afford to be in this market. You're basically, legalization is another form of corporatism and cronyism. So that's why I'm against it. But either one's going to be better for us.
Right.
Yeah.
In my ideal world, it's legalized, but but then the contradiction, we actually have some common sense regulations and stuff in place, but that's very difficult to achieve. And I'm just a bit of a naive guy. As far as marijuana, And it's just kind of an interesting topic. Then when you come to the quote unquote hard drugs of meth, the opioids, et cetera, I'm not like if it was my ideal world, we go to a decriminalization as well. And then I would love to see a little bit more of, like, I would say, a legalized and regulated, but extremely regulated. And when I say regulated, so like, for example, like a tobacco company, they can't run ads on TV. Alcohol companies can't. I mean, every other damn commercial, if you're watching a sporting event, is for some other form of alcohol. But tobacco's been really just smashed down, and it has been effective. Now, again, there's debates as far as like what you should do and all of that. But I do think that decriminalization for the hard drugs is definitely the path, and to me, that's one of the things that gets so lost, is because I keep saying I'm for ending the drug war, and what almost the majority, and again, the polls show the majority of America, like 70% of Americans are like, yeah, I'm for legalizing marijuana. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, all of it. All of it. Yeah.
There's still a whole, like, because again, we've pretty much gone that route. Like, I forget how many states now with marijuana. It's like, and eventually, at some point, I think that cat's gonna be out of the bag, and to where that's every state in the federal laws at some point, get turned around. I don't know how long that's going to take, but at some point that'll happen. Yeah. But there's still this massive demand, for these other very hard and very addictive and very destructive drugs. And there seems to be really I shouldn't say no, but very little progress. You'll see an occasional city that says, we're going to sort of decriminalize possession up to this amount, right, et cetera. But I don't really see much progress, as far as that. And that's what I think. And I know that we're both on that same wavelength, that maybe exactly what our ideal scenario is. And again, I don't know either, because again, these are hypothetical situations. Like, we don't really have like a perfect model that we can look to, because it's all new territory,
Right. Ideally for me, I think, just a marketplace where consumers are informed to the utmost, where it's upfront, it's honest. When you buy a milligram of something, the strength, exactly what it does, what's in it, and if you are lied to, you can seek damages in court. That's the marketplace that I want to see happen.
Yeah. If that heroin is laced with some crazy level of fentanyl,
mm-hmm.
And that person knows that, and they're knowingly distributing this stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's like any other consumer product at that point.
And we're so far away from, like, especially here in Oklahoma, like, we're talking about a needle exchange and safe injections. Like, you can't even buy clean needles here in Oklahoma, and it's a municipal thing. It's not a statewide thing, but there is not a municipality in Oklahoma that will sell you needles over the counter without a prescription.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot purchase clean needles out here. Yeah. So, I mean, just talking to somebody about recreational cocaine is like, what? Like, they're not ready for that yet, but I'm not shutting up.
Yeah. So I'm in Florida. I would say it's more of a purple state, because it's a swing. It's not blue. It's not red. Well, I mean, it's blue and it's red depending upon which county you're in, but overall, like, the numbers, it's kind of purple. It's kind of right down the middle. The first op-ed I ever had published was in the Palm Beach Post. I had to do with that topic. And it was something that I was just like, my God. It was about needle exchanges. So, like, it was like one of the first ones. It's down in Miami, in one of the rougher spots. And it's Miami. There's a lot of drugs down there. And this, like, one sort of pilot program was allowed, and just all that they had to go through just to get that one. And we couldn't get it, through other parts of the state. And it's just like, this is a state that has really high HIV rates, in certain areas and stuff. And it's like, it's just so frustrating that something, in my opinion, that's simple. Again, if people are willing to look at the evidence and not just give it the instant reaction, because I get it. A lot of people from a certain conservative point of view, they hear that and it just sounds crazy. It just sounds crazy because they haven't looked at the actual evidence. But, needle exchange has been around for like 30 something years here in the United States. And we were kind of talking about the safe injection stuff. That stuff, those further experiments have been going on for quite a while as well. But even in the United States, this has been around and it's been proven to be effective. It doesn't, there's no proof that suggests that by doing that suddenly people, if NGO workers are going around to obvious people who have an opioid addiction and provide them with a free needle, that suddenly like teenagers go, oh, I'm going to start the habit now. I want to try that because there's a free, clean needle. Like there's just no evidence to suggest it. All it is just a simple common sense measure to try to help society. Like let's reduce the flow of HIV and hepatitis and all these different things, and just some of the additional suffering that goes along with that addiction. Like it's maddening, you know? But no, I love what you're doing, man. And I love that you're doing it in a certain part of the country. Let's just be real. Like you're on the outside culturally as far as that issue.
Big time.
You are an outsider, and that does take mental strength to do what you're doing. So hats off to you, man.
I appreciate it, man. I mean, it's just one of those things. Like we've all got our area where we're good, and this is the area where I'm good. This is what I know. You know, I leave the economics and all that other fun stuff up to the other guys, but it just so happened I live in Oklahoma and I'm good on drug policy, you know, so it is what it is.
Right. So this was something that affected you personally, I guess, was what I was reading between the lines there. So then, if you don't mind, I hope you don't mind the guy, the interviewee interviewing the interviewer. I'm just kind of curious. So it was, I guess, in just your experience with this, you're clean now. You're an advocate for all these types of things. Like what your experience was, and you've just seen how this is all screwed up. So I guess, are there any other like specific policies, I guess, because again, I've never experienced drug addiction. I did smoke some pot and stuff when I was young, never messed with the hard drugs, haven't touched one in close to 20 years or so, or illegal drugs. Again, I mentioned I think that's important to note. I do have a little alcohol from time to time. That is a drug, by the way, folks. It's just a legal one. It's a government sanctioned one. I'm just kind of curious, like, are there any other, like, from having experiences gone through that hell of having to live essentially a criminal lifestyle where at the end of the day, this was a consensual crime that you committed. You were a grown adult making this choice. What, from that perspective, like, what would you tell me, audience members, like, what, where are some changes? Like, what are some things that we don't know about that you think that we should know about?
I would say that, the blowback, and it gets mentioned, it does get mentioned, quite a bit, especially nowadays, but the blowback of labeling people felons whenever they leave, you're causing them to try to find gainful employment. Because let's be honest, as soon as you get released from prison, that's not just it. You don't just have the label of felon. You got the label of felon with court fines, probation fees, forced participation, and all sorts of counseling and stuff like that, that taxpayers ain't paying for that. You're paying for that out of pocket. So you have to find gainful employment that's going to let you go and take a drug test at a moment's notice, which is it's very, very difficult. So the reason that you see recidivism rates so high is because of this just ridiculous notion that we have and these expectations that we have on these people that are going through this system. And so I think more than anything, I walk this fine line. And it's like I said, I want to see more opportunities for addicts who need an introduction into rehabilitation, but I also am hesitant to push for that because I don't want the guy across town who's never smoked a joint to have to pay for it. That's the big thing. So like when I see places like Oregon, they decriminalized everything, and then they expanded opportunities for people to go to drug program rehabilitation. Like once a government program gets created, it's there. It ain't going to go away.
Right.
It's only going to expand. That's just the way it is. Right. So the logical conclusion is that at some point in time, that government agency or program is going to get so big that funding is going to be an issue. The only way to combat that is to allow those substances to be brought into the marketplace and somehow pay for it. And I know, as my more ANCAP friends and audience members are probably cringing at that notion, but I think that, it could be a mutually beneficial market. And as far as like people who aren't in the know of how the criminal justice system works, like I'm telling you right now, like I've talked to both sides. I know what both sides have in their mind, either for the drug war or against it. The best way to bridge that gap is to marry the market and the solution.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Well, I get where you're going. What I've come across so much, and again, it's just because I'm a researcher and also just personal experiences. I mean, I have, let's just say, friends who've been in the system too. And it's like, right, you get out, you have this label. It's so darn difficult to get a job. And typically the jobs that are going to hire you at that point are not high wage jobs. So just there's a certain level of depression and frustration. You got some government official to tell you to pee in this cup, and if you don't show up by this time, you're going back to jail.
Mm-hmm.
All of these types of things, and it's like I just have a certain sympathy. And again, I'm not telling people, I'm not telling them to go out, but you could understand how somebody who really even intended to stay clean could be so frustrated with that experience that they just say, "F it, man. I'm just gonna, do it. Like I need an outlet from all of this frustration. Like you did nothing, to help me out." And I see it all the time where, again, people, literally if they're on parole, even if they weren't in there for drugs, but again, they tested positive, for some marijuana, and they're just going back to prison, and it gets back, in my opinion, to something that you said there, is that it's that conflict of interest. There's a sort of, I guess, a monetary incentive for throwing people in prison, and there's just certain budgets and there's all these types of things, and there aren't policies in place. You're that probation officer. You got to justify your job. If just nobody goes back to prison, like somebody's going to probably look at you a little funny.
Right.
Every one of these people are fine, upstanding citizens, Mr. Probation Officer A, really? And you become this busybody, and you get on this power trip of forcing people to show up at any time, anywhere, to jump through these hoops for you. Yeah, that is something that's just always bothered me. And yeah, like I said, we can legalize marijuana or whatever, but this stuff is still out there, and it's just those incentives for locking somebody up is one of again, it's just, when we get back, because I've talked so much about like internationally what this stuff does, and it is important to remember. And I think more people are becoming aware of that, but it's just how ingrained this stuff is, and just how once you get in that system, of how difficult it is to get out of that system. I mean, we think about, they can't keep the drugs out of prisons,
No, they can't. Not at all.
I mean, and again, it's usually probably somebody, involved with the prison, some correctional officer or something like that. And typically, again, when people who are, government officials, and they get caught doing this stuff, they get, they're going to get in trouble, but it's never that same level as the civilian who's involved in this stuff, so just there's not really a proper set of incentives and consequences. That's some of the stuff that I just see heartbreaking. One thing I think, one area, if you want, we can maybe go into it, is just like how that actual, one of the things that's always bothered me is that incentive for the snitches and stuff. And I don't like to use that word, but I think it's something we probably should kind of discuss a little bit. I don't know how much more time you want to cover here. But that is one of the things that's always just broken my heart. And again, when we talk about how there's two different justice systems, right? So when somebody from the Bush family, I remember Jeb Bush's daughter, when she got busted for, illegal prescription drugs, it was, this is just, a tragedy. We got to get her help and stuff. She goes into the probation. So she what's the term? Reoffends or whatever while she's she doesn't go back to prison. She's a Bush, and it's just such a different system for other people. And once you get in there, one of the things that just always bother me is there are actual snitches who make money. Like this is their actual career, One of the examples, and there's just so many, I'll throw this out there for people that I'm not trying to be morbid, but I just kind of want to paint a picture real quick. Or again, maybe there's one of these people out there who's not a libertarian and aware of this kind of stuff. But in my opinion, the most heartbreaking example I ever came across was there was this like prolific snitch. And if I remember, it was Dallas, Texas. It was in Texas. Not long after 9/11, like this, just they're like, we just keep getting record cocaine bust after record cocaine bust. So what was happening was, again, these cocaine busts, and it was always cocaine, by the way. Long story short, and they were always busting these, Mexican, people. And what ended up happening was the snitch and the cop were in on it, right? So the snitch gets paid really good quality money for every bust. The local police department pays him money. He's a guy who had been busted before, and this is how he's working off his time. And in the process, since he's given them these quote unquote really big busts, he's also getting paid because Dallas Police Department, they're getting these really nice headlines and all this kind of stuff. Long story short, it was like this guy was responsible for something like 30 or 40 high-level busts. Every one of them was a Mexican who didn't really speak any English, right? Luckily, fortunately, there was this one public defender who just went above and beyond, for these people, right? And ultimately, she goes to the home, and talks to the wife of one of these guys who's locked up, and she's looking around at this home, and we're talking as skid row as it gets, just as poor as it gets. And she's like, this doesn't seem to match up with a guy moving 50 kilos of coke. Like this, yeah, you might not be making that much money, but like this doesn't match. Something doesn't match, and she's looking at the guy and seeing just like the dirt under his fingers, the calloused hands. Is like, this is a guy who looks like he does, he does some day laboring, and barely getting by. And the guy basically explains to her, I was just told to go and meet with this person at this certain time for a job site. So long story short, this snitch and the cop were in on this ruse in which they were basically taking chalk. I forget what the technical term for chalk. Chalk. Kilos of chalk with like a little drop or two of the cocaine so that it shows up and tests positive, and just literally setting up unsuspecting Mexican immigrant. I don't know if they're legal immigrants or illegal. Nonetheless, people who really just couldn't defend themselves, and send them up. There'd be like 40 kilos in the trunk of a car out in like some like rec yard or something. Unsuspecting guy just thinks he's going for a day labor job, ends up looking at like 30 years. And every one of these guys, they all plead guilty because they just know how the system works. They know they got no shot. And maybe one day they'll get a little bit of freedom if they just plead guilty. Because if they take this thing to court, they've got no means, they've got no nothing. They've got a public defender who's overwhelmed. But like I said, fortunately, eventually this one public defender just started to figure it out. She starts going in there like, no, I want to test this evidence again, and starts connecting the dots. Like, wait a minute, here's another one where it's just chalk. And it's the same cop and it's the same snitch. But long story short, eventually those people did get freed. A lot of these, I don't know, they were in there for some time. People who were falsely convicted on an absolute ruse by a snitch and a corrupt cop. To me, the most disturbing, well, it's not the most disturbing. The most disturbing part is just some friggin' guy who's just barely getting by and getting set up by some snitch and going to prison and thinking he's never going to see his family again. But in my opinion, one of the worst parts of this story is that when the actual snitch and the actual cop got busted, they both got something like 3 years. How friggin' heinous is that? Like, wow. You just so you could make money and how the other guy can get his bus. And then, when you get those busts, guess what? You're going to get promoted and you're going to make your money that way. So just as awful as it gets. And that's how our system works, man. And meanwhile, the people who were, supposedly these drug traffickers, when again, all it was just some chalk with a little bit of cocaine, legit cocaine sprinkled on it, we're looking at like 20, 30 years. Wow. But yeah, man, it's just, there's just so many stories like this. And again, I know that we've already got this supportive audience, but I'm just begging some people, man, if we got somebody outside the bubble, please reevaluate, like, please listen to us,
Yes. Hey, I still have enough old school in me that I have nothing but utter contempt for the snitch. I have more contempt for the snitch than I do for the cop who's setting people up, because that snitch is you're right there alongside us, buddy. Like you're the one doing this stuff with us. Like I have a couple of convictions, and on a couple of those, there was an opportunity for me to roll and get out of it, but not to my licks. It's just what you did. But even more so than that, so like what ends up happening, like let's just say that these people who are set up, and it's just a unwilling participant or unknowing participant, they know that they're doing something a little bit bad. They just happen to run across somebody in a bar and ended up having this connection. Well, when that officer's like, look, you're going to get 30 to life unless you tell me who you talk to. Well, here's what ends up happening. So that let's just say this guy snitches. Well, that's going to be open information. Like that cop's not going to protect that snitch, like in a lot of cases. That snitch ends up getting killed. Their life is over at that point for being a cog in this machine, and it never stops. Every single city across the country, this is happening.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought it up, though. I am glad.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this stuff, and one of my takeaways. So, and you may not like this part, is so you probably heard of like the Stop Snitching campaign and stuff. Like it's sort of like this like kind of hip hop movement and stuff. And what I feel is, again, it gets back to this whole war on drugs, where this sort of rebellious image, and some things sort of what's the term I'm looking for? Just things shift around, right? So I think most people, even your conservative, antagonists against you, would sort of agree with that mentality. If you're in the game and you're like snitching, like you're just a rat, and there's no sympathy for you. But what sort of happened is that then this whole anti-snitching thing is then sort of drifted to stuff outside of this stuff, where if somebody, if somebody's just a person in the inner city who witnesses a murder or something, and they want to inform to the police about this stuff, just doing basic civic duty. But because of how drugs and the rebellious aspect with this prohibition has kind of perverted some things, that it's like, yeah, that person's a snitch. And it's like, no, I don't view that person as a snitch.
No.
Like there needs to be some level of basic decency. But what's happened with, again, this stuff kind of gets connected to counterculture, and otherwise, pretty moral, law-abiding people kind of tend to shift in that direction. A lot of this stuff gets distorted as well. So that was one of the things, I'm glad you kind of gave me the platform that's just always bothered me, because there is sort of some distortion with that and some twisting with it. And I can totally understand that. I don't really have any sympathy for that. Anybody in that system, but I also understand it, because that is how the system works. Mm-hmm. Part of my problem, it's one of the things I address in the book there, is how a lot of times what the system does is, the prosecutors, these government agents, they sort of work their way up the trail, right? So the low level person, they snitch. And then we finally get to the high person, or the highest person that they can get, without it, right? And what ends up happening a lot of the time, so that we'll call him the kingpin or the leader or whatever, ends up actually getting leniency and ends up getting less time, because the difference is they have more information to trade. They know all the little players. So the big guy ends up getting a fraction of the time or no time. And then all the little players end up getting the serious time, because they don't have as much time. They don't have as much valuable information to trade. And then when it looks like on paper for these government folks, are like, yeah, we just took down a 34-person ring. But meanwhile, the guy who's really running the thing is either free and probably still working with them, because then, he's still a player and he's got, information, and he's out there. So usually the worst offenders are the ones who are benefiting. I probably shouldn't say usually, but I've just seen so many examples like that. The little nickel and dime guy on the corner, who just can't get a job anywhere. He's got a record and all that kind of stuff. And again, it doesn't excuse he shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff, but he's doing it. That's the guy who's getting the real time, versus the guy, his boss's boss's boss is the one who's walking free, and actually probably make some money on the DEA, DEA payroll there. And that really is how our system works.
Yeah. And I've known local traffickers. I mean, I'm talking weight, kilos, like
Mhm.
they would set up people. It's just a known fact. Never knew when it was going to happen or where. You just knew that these people were in cahoots with the law at one point in time or another in order to keep their stature and their position. It's a network, it's a mechanism. It's just, yeah, dude, it's so far gone. But
Right.
that's just kind of one of those things. Once you open the door for that snitching thing, it's just you weren't ever going to have good results with that. Of course,
Right.
that was going to be abused. Why wouldn't it be?
Well, I think a lot of it just comes down to, again, we're all these individuals, right? And so and so's, this part of this agency and all that. And again, people tend to work on their own self-interest. So what doesn't get the better, headline, and they're evaluated just on some of these statistics and all that kind of stuff. So that is really, even though it's not really effective with ending the war on drugs, but it's more effective for their personal means. And again, that's why I try to use that term racket, because again, I really do view a lot of this stuff as a racket, and it's not. These things end up resulting with these kind of illogical results. But again, we understand why, because people tend to operate, and agencies and bureaucracies tend to operate within their own self-interest.
Right.
So, like I said, with that snitching stuff there, in the example where the kingpin ends up walking away and then gets all those people, again, because they get the 34 people on the charges, it looks great in the headlines that we took all these people down. At the end of the day, those people don't really know who Mr. Big Shot was. So it doesn't matter that you didn't really effectively stop anything. Again, Mr. Big Shot probably still has some value to them, even though realistically, like, everybody in the streets and everyone involved kind of knows who was really doing everything. And I just don't think that you really stopped anything. You didn't really do anything to affect it. Again, if we really truly wanted to end this stuff, then we would do different policies,
I agree. Well, Brian, this has been one of my favorite interviews. I love all my interviews, but man, you were so knowledgeable. I appreciate you sitting down and talking with me. Where can people find you?
I would suggest go to my website. It's I got a funny spelled name. So my name's Brian Saady. The last name, it's B-R-I like Indiana, A-N, Brian. Last name is Saady, so it's spelled funny. S like Sam, A like Apple, A like Apple, D like dog, Y like yellow.com. So I've got a series of books. I do some social media stuff. I'm not so active on that. Never been as you can tell, I'm long-winded. So when you got to fit it to 140 characters, I'm not
it's a little tough.
Not as effective. So that's why I kind of like the long-form stuff. So you'll see me write articles for different. I want to kind of focus on eventually getting my website up and all of that versus I've been, writing for different organizations such as like Counterpunch and the American Conservative, antiwar.com, just a lot of different stuff that I think that your audience looks at and probably appreciates. But, I've got some books on there as well. Got a podcast. Going to do a second season of my podcast. I need to do it. I want to do it as soon as possible, but a little tied up. But yeah, I got to do a second season of my Rackets podcast. So got a lot of different stuff that I think people might be interested in. It's pretty much a purely libertarian audience that I think that most of the content they're going to kind of like a lot of what I say. And I think that the stuff that they don't like or don't necessarily agree with, it might give them a little different perspective. That is my hope as far as all that's concerned.
Right on. Well, Brian, thank you so much. I'll include all of that information in the show notes, and be sure to tag people with your address if they ask about you. And man, anytime you want to come back on the show, dude, open invite. You're more than welcome to come on.
Man, I loved it, man. I know you've been praising me, but I really do respect what you're doing. This just whole message of what you're talking about. I love it, and I don't hear a whole lot of people saying it. It's as far as what you're trying to accomplish. There's some subtlety to what you're trying to do, and I think you're doing it in a tough ecosystem there. So I would love to come back. And as you can tell, I love to talk about this stuff. I could bore you guys to death.
I'm not bored at all, man. This is awesome. Right on. All right. Well, Brian, you have a good evening, sir.
Absolutely. You as well, man. Thanks again for letting me on here, man.
All right. What did I tell you guys? How great was that? Man, Brian was a fantastic guest. He had alluded to a second season of his podcast, and I hope that gets off the ground soon because, man, I guarantee you I'm going to be a subscriber. So thanks again to Brian for coming on. And Patrick, if you're listening, thanks a lot for the recommendation. Man, you do not miss. You guys were awesome. So, yeah, there you have it, man. Great content. A lot of great information. I know I learned a whole lot about, especially about the Haiti thing, a little bit more nuance on, exactly what the Iran-Contra thing was about and everything else in between. So with that, go forth, do some research, look into it, check it out yourself. And I'm just going to get right into the song of the day. This is a band called Against All Authority. I saw these guys a while back, and I'm going to say it. I really don't I'm not ditching them. I'm not. They sucked live. They did. The lead singer had a broken leg. I don't know what the hell happened. This show just sucked. I think maybe the venue was it. But anyway, all their music on their records is just awesome. Kind of ska punkish. But this is, like I said, Against All Authority. And this song is called All Fall Down. So with that, I will leave you with All Fall Down.